landscape ecology. In terms of seascapes, I suppose over the years I've worked on various aspects of seascape, from estuary management plans. I worked a bit in Bangladesh on the impacts of the shrimp industry on landscapes. I worked on the recreation strategy of Northumberland coastal areas, and various other things. I'm also working presently, we talked earlier about co-production. I'm at the moment working on something called Hydro Citizenship, which is an AHRC funded program looking at people's relationship with water, which obviously has links here. So that's just really a little bit about me. So the project that I'm just going to, the research that this paper is based upon was funded under the NERC Valuing Nature Network Interdisciplinary Fund, and it had 14 co-investigators, all from different disciplines. It was very painful, I have to say. Particularly painful from the fact that working with economists, actually, not my colleagues, the marine biologists, who I find very easy to work with. So there has been some talk about interdisciplinary working here, but I wouldn't underestimate the difficulties of doing that. Our focus was primarily on policy, and the starting points for the research were really that natural science is the main source of information used in evidence-led policy still to support environmental management. There is some focus on social sciences, mostly on the impacts of policy, I would say, and policymakers are often unsure how to measure it and use this. Cultural values are increasingly something that is coming into focus, but again, I think policymakers really struggle with how to incorporate cultural values. So better integrated understandings are needed, better modelling and better aids, decision support tools are needed for policymakers. The particular research challenges that we identified were that information is often lost in translation in cross-disciplinary working. Policymakers often find it difficult to deal with spatial and temporal trends over time. Often policymaking is very short scale. And there's a mismatch of timelines between policy cycles and science surveys, as well as ecological conditions. And there's a need to respond to ecosystem services approach, which is something that's coming more and more into focus. But sometimes these services are negatively related to each other, and that is something that policymakers find difficult. Thank you. So the main objectives of the overall research, which I don't have time to really go into detail with, but was to examine a method that would reflect a range of stakeholders and discipline areas in relation to values and marine protected areas. So it was to try and understand the kind of public benefits that you would get from MPAs, and in particular we looked at the use of a BBN, a Bayesian Belief Network. And I have to say, I am not a BBN specialist. I am not a statistician. Luckily, we had people who were on the team. So in summary, could we identify the relevant values, and could a BBN actually provide a way of understanding these values under different scenarios of policy and policy change? We used existing data, which my colleague Selina Stead had from the Western Indian Ocean. And this was a range of data, social, marine and economic data that was gathered in various ways. Our methods for our project were basically literature review, and then a deliberative expert workshops, scenario building using the BBN, and then stakeholder review of what we'd found, of the modelling process. So For those of you who've not really seen a BBN, this is kind of what it looks like. The illustrations at the top were the place where the data we used was from. And one of the issues when you're building a model, and I'm not a great modeler, I have to say, I'm a landscape planner, but one of the problems, of course, is you build a model, but then you need data in order to test the model, but you need data in order to build the model. You know, so there's this problem. So we built the model using the process I've described, but we used this data that we already have. Now, in an ideal world, you would then, having identified what's needed by the model, you would go out and collect data in order to retest the model. Okay, but it is this chicken and egg situation that we get into. The thing about a Bayesian belief network is that it allows you to build scenarios. It allows you to what's called horizon scan. So you can see into the future. Because it has these links, you can change something. It has great nuances. So you can change something, and by building the different links in different areas of your data, you can see what the impacts of that change could be. So that's the basic idea. Thank you. And just at the basic level, there are nodes within the model. So, for example, this shows an illustration of a node where A is the parent of B and C, and B is the parent of C. So A has a direct link, okay, to C, and an indirect link through B to C. So this is how you can see various different relationships that are going on. And the advantage of a BBN is that you can put in a wide range of cross-disciplinary information, such as marine indicators. You can put in quantitative and qualitative information. So communities' perceptions of health, for example, and marine ecosystem exploitation. You can also put in livelihood data, which is particularly useful when you're talking to policymakers. Luckily, my friend and colleague Pia Shushet did all that. Thank you. My main contribution was to try and help us conceptualize and think about values and what that means. And when we think about values, it's much more complicated than we first think. There's been a lot of talk about values, I think, over the last 2 days in various different ways. And the concept of value is now generally considered to be a social construction arising from the cultural context of time and place. But people hold values and also express value for things. Thus, it's important to understand how values are developed and how things are valued. They can be identified and expressed by a person or group in some way. Cultural and social values are generally understood to be those values that are shared by a group or community, or are given legitimacy through a socially accepted way of assigning value. So there are multiple ways of valuing landscapes and seascapes, as we've seen, and it's a very slippery concept. People have talked about values in lots of different ways here. And I would also say that different disciplines look at values in very different ways, and that, of course, is one of the problems when you're working in an interdisciplinary context. And by the way, I was in the Galapagos last year, so thank you. My colleague Ian Thompson's examination of values in one group of experts or professionals, that is landscape architects, indicated a multitude of divergent values. So different cultural forms will generate different values, as we've heard also. However, no overarching values may be apparent. Values may overlap. They can't necessarily be separated, even if you wanted to. Values are often rivalrous and conflictual, and they are complex. And values for different things may not be able to be weighted against one or the other. They're not comparable. And this is, again, one of the problems of working with values. Values may be positive or negative. This diagram of Ian's actually is based on positive values rather than negative values. However, in the political world, the emphasis is often on monetary values, and our keynote speaker this afternoon, I think, expressed that very nicely. Some values, I would suggest, are translatable into financial terms, and some may not be. Money can be used as a proxy, but it's not always desirable to do so, and I think we should keep a hold of that. Willingness to play methods are often suggested in relation to trying to capture values of recreational resources, for example. So how much would you contribute to a programme that maintains the landscape of a national park? But I think there are problems with this. As Thompson suggests, we are used to pay to go to galleries to see paintings, but we do not confuse the price of the ticket with the worth of the painting. Thus, I think we should be rightly suspicious about turning everything into financial evaluation. Policy often enshrines the separation of categories of value using predetermined aspects, and some lists as a list here. And often, as we know, assessments of value are often carried out by experts in different disciplines. Often what's forgotten is the lived experience of seascapes and landscapes and what people actually value who live in those places. And if we're putting those kind of values into modules, they can result in very static models. And the nature of shared values and understanding socio-cultural dynamics in communities becomes difficult. Often overlapping values are lost. And what we really need is some kind of synthesis that allows us to pull values together and understand how they affect each other. Thank you. One of the key difficulties in relation to methods for understanding values is the expressions are not immediately obvious. But I think we had to talk about co-production earlier. And I think these new methods that are coming out about co-construction, co-production, help us to reveal values. But we can also do things like look at poetry, look at literature, look at things that people value. I just pulled this out as something. This is a representation of value of the sea by JFK in one of his speeches. Somebody talked about old charts, looking at the land from the sea. There's all sorts of things like that we can look at. So I think we are becoming better at understanding how we can grasp and understand values, particularly cultural and intangible values. I think we should remember that people are not born with values, although people are born into cultural value systems, and that's also quite important. In general, it's suggested that universal socio-cultural values can be identified, and socio-cultural values are variously categorized, with the suggestion that while over time values may vary, the fundamental nature of the values tend to remain. What we need to think about, I think, when we're talking about things like MPAs, are the needs of the group take precedence over the needs of the individual, particularly when the implementation of these kind of protected areas have an impact on communities. Thank you. Community values or public values are often assumed to be the same as shared values, although they are often what can be described as aggregated individual values. Interaction between people helps shared values to emerge, as in these kind of co-production methodologies. Shared values are understood as the values people collectively hold as social beings, not simply in terms of individual costs and benefits or preferences and motivations. but in terms perhaps of social rights and wrongs. And it gets very ethically and morally charged talking about these kind of issues. So shared values, therefore, are fundamentally different to the concept of plural, individual, or aggregated values. So you can't simply add a lot of values up and say that equals shared values. It doesn't work like that. And the nuances between these things are difficult. The terminology is extremely difficult, and as I said, understood differently by different disciplines. These values are also often hidden, and so we do need ways of trying to bring them out. Thank you. One before, actually. Let's jump one. Okay, thanks. This illustrates one of the diagrams that I developed myself in struggling with all this in relation to this BBN process. In considering social well-being and the values that are involved in this understanding of what social well-being is. In our project, we tried to capture both individual and shared relevant values by looking at the values identified in the ecosystem services literature, and that was particularly useful. But also I looked at things like seascape analysis and some of these other things to do my own experience in relation to cultural landscapes. And there was much debate in our team about how these elements should or shouldn't be broken down and how they could or couldn't be used within the BBN. One thing I would say about the BBN is it really helps discussion. It was really good for them. I don't know if any of you have ever used a BBN, but I would say that one of the big benefits is the way it engendered discussion over difficult topics, actually, really hard stuff. And in building a BBN, key linkages, feedbacks and dependencies between the different types of data could be identified, and the relationships could be shown explicitly within the model. Values could be weighted in different ways and uncertainties explored. This, I would say, is particularly helpful in relation, as I say, to the things that are normally hidden in policy. So this was the final kind of simplified model, and I would say it has many layers. And the final model provided separate outcome values for each sub-model based on discussions with policymakers who suggested that this would help in the identification of changes in the subnets. While they would be able to observe changes in all sectors, they would also be able to assess the impacts of possible trade-offs needed in policy implementation. So, in fact, what we ended up having was these three areas, because that is the way policy works. There were considerable difficulties between transposing desired components into the model, and long discussions took place. We didn't use a monetary value for all of the values, but a categorical or quantitative scale indicator was adopted. And I think it's really good that there's going to be a PhD workshop on BBN methods, because I think it's a really useful way of looking at these integrated systems. This was really exciting on the Galapagos, by the way. One of the best moments of my life. The project conclusions and further information on the overall research is on the web if you're interested in looking at it under the Valuing Nature Network website. The exploration carried out in this project suggests that decision support systems need to have the potential to differentiate and capture socio-cultural values that may be individual, aggregated and shared. I think it's important that we understand what those different things are. Traditional monetary valuation methods are grounded in the views and preferences of the individual, while many socio-cultural values are shared. So this is where the difficulty is and where we need to understand the differences. In addition, many cultural values cannot be quantified, I would suggest, or captured by using economic methods. And they are invisible, particularly to outsiders, as many experts are. So we need to develop ways of trying to capture those. And these are important issues, because we need to identify relevant values if we are to have any chance of developing policies that actually do what we want them to do. I would also suggest that we should not be simply applying land-based policy and frameworks to the sea. That's a different paper. That's out already. Thank you. The BBN development process proved useful, as I've said, I think particularly in thrashing out and testing ideas, particularly in the different disciplinary contexts. And there are many more questions that I think this project raised, actually, as quite prominently. The feeling generally is that there's a need to develop better methods to understand collective social values. So there are a number of areas to consider if we are to capture social values as suggested by our research, some of which are listed here. Thank you. In particular, we need to consider all kinds of ways of identifying the values that are embedded by humans within these complex systems that we've been talking about over the last 2 days, particularly the cultural and the ecological. And my own view is that we are a species living with other species. I think we need to try not to separate the fact that we are a species living within the whole system. The marine environment was identified in academic circles as the ultimate common pool resource by Eleanor Ostrom. And I think that is why it's a useful place to study this idea of common and shared values. And I would suggest co-produced research and co-constructing knowledge is a useful tool that can feed into the sort of models that I've been talking about here, the BBN, and to help reveal to outsiders what is actually valued in these systems. It's clear from the literature that judgment about what others value is difficult unless information is shared, and we think of innovative ways to gather the relevant data to examine models such as BBNs. As Nordby suggests, the chances of securing intercultural communication are improved if values are recognised and appreciated. Thank you.